think he's actually already live streaming it just to get it started, so we'll wait until it's actually time, but then we can jump in.
And then Kadani, take your mask off when we start.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I will too.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
It just muffles things enough.
Yeah,
that
it does
makes
make it hard.
difficult to understand.
Oh, I forgot these are big buckets. Welcome to our Charter Amendment Community Forum. I'm Sally Bauer, and I am the Tangletown Neighborhood Association Executive Director. This morning, I'm representing our Charter Education Team, which is a partnership of Southwest Minneapolis Neighborhood Associations who are hosting this event today. We came together because we felt it was critical for Minneapolis voters to have the opportunity to learn more about the charter amendments and be informed going into this year's election. We have a website with additional information, including a handout with ballot language and key arguments for each amendment, plus a recording of a presentation by City Clerk Casey Carl, which covers the proposed amendments and how they will alter the charter. If passed. Our website is kingfield.org/election-education-2021. Early voting is available now, and Election Day is November 2nd. Learn more about where and how to vote, what's on your ballot, and more at vote.minneapolis.gov. I want to thank Mayflower Church for sharing their space with us today, the Charter Education Team for planning this event, and the sponsoring neighborhood associations, Armitage, Cedar Isles Dean, East Baday-Makaska, Fulton, Hale Page Diamond Lake, Kenny, Kingfield, Linden Hills, Lowry Hill East, Lyndale, Lyndhurst, South Uptown, Tangletown, and West Makaska. Today's event is being live streamed on YouTube, and the recording will be available after the event. In-person attendees are invited to join us outdoors in the courtyard after the event for a chance to continue the conversation with our presenting organizations. Our forum is being moderated today by Liz Nordling of the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area. I'll now pass it off to Liz, who will introduce our speakers and share the format of today's event. Welcome, and thank you to Liz.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome to this Charter Amendment Community Forum for the amendments that will be on the November ballot in Minneapolis. My name is Liz Nordling and I'll be moderating this forum. I do not live in Minneapolis. We will deal with each amendment separately. I will read the language that will appear on the ballot and introduce the speakers. Each side will have up to 1 minute to answer questions and up to 30 seconds for a rebuttal for each question. We will start with the amendment that reads, authorizing the City Council to enact rent control ordinance. The language is, shall the Minneapolis City Charter be amendment to authorize the City Council to regulate rents on private residential property in the City of Minneapolis, with the general nature of the amendments being indicated in the explanatory note below, which is made part of this ballot. And the explanatory note contains, it says this amendment would authorize the City Council to regulate rents on private residential property in the City of Minneapolis by ordinance. Provide that an ordinance regulating rents on private residential property could be enacted in two different and independent ways. The City Council may enact the ordinance. The City Council may refer the ordinance as a ballot question to be decided by voters for approval at an election. If more than half of the votes cast on the ballot question are in favor of its adoption, the ordinance would take effect 30 days after the election or at such other time as provided in the ordinance. Our speakers are, speaking for the amendment, Kanani Omar from the Minneapolis United for Rent Control, and against the amendment, Cecil Smith from Sensible Housing Ballot Committee. And we will begin with our first question, and it goes first to Kanani Omar. What are the main advantages or disadvantages of rent stabilization?
Thank you. As we're talking about this, I also want to be clear that in terms of conversation about the policy, what's on the amendment would open the door. Currently, due to a state ban, the only way to pass rent control and rent stabilization is by cities putting it on the ballot and having the majority of residents vote yes. So in terms of what happens on November, this is a two-step process that would, if passed, would allow us to have a discussion about what rent control could look like. We are having a housing crisis, and this is an important tool that will not solve all of our issues, but would stop the gentrification and price gouging that are happening to communities, particularly communities of color.
Thank you. Now speaking against the amendment is Cecil Smith.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, Kanani. It's great to have this conversation, and to the hosts of Southwest Minneapolis neighborhoods. Thank you for having us here today. The ballot measure that's before voters would open the door for rent control, and we don't think that rent control should be a housing policy that we adopt in our community while acknowledging that we have a housing crisis. It's the wrong solution to the problem. But I'll agree that there are some advantages. Rent control does advantage the existing renters in rent-controlled units. But it's the future renters that are harmed. It's the future residents that want to move to our community that are harmed. So that comes about through lower quality housing, reductions in housing production, and the conversion of rental housing to home ownership.
Thank you. Does anyone have any additional comments? Yes, Kanani.
To the point of this policy potentially harming future renters, one aspect that I want to highlight is because we don't have a policy forward right now, it's hard to make that distinction. If we had a universal policy that protected all tenants, it wouldn't be renters who are able to have this benefit and renters who are not.
Any additional comments, Cecil?
No.
We'll move on to the next question, and it goes to Cecil first. If this amendment is adopted, what kind of rent stabilization policy would you support, or what kind of policy do you think would be adopted?
Well, what I have heard being proposed, and I've done some other forums with this, is something similar to the St. Paul ballot question, which is a 3% rent cap with no inflation, applies to all properties with no exemptions, and there would be vacancy control, which means that the unit could not be reset to market pricing if it became vacant, which is pretty typical around the country of rent stabilization policies, where the recently adopted measure in Oregon, California, New York, they have vacancy decontrol. So there is no specific proposal, but what I've been hearing in these conversations is similar to the St. Paul proposal. And of course, none of these work. And in fact, the measure in St. Paul is one of the strictest that has ever been imagined.
Thank you. The question now goes to Kanani.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, that there are the conversations about what rent control could look like are similar to St. Paul's. There is, I think, a need to tie rent increases to CPI or inflation, or no more than 3%. The study commissioned by the city of Minneapolis showed that prior to the recession in 2009, it was unheard of, essentially, to have a 5% increase in rent. Most renters in Minneapolis, prior to 2009, saw a 2 to 3% increase. We're looking to offer that same, we want to have that same predictability for all renters. When we talk about universal rent control, it's important to highlight that in Minneapolis specifically, the housing stock, 57% of rentals are in single-family homes. Nearly 30% are in duplexes. So having a policy that is only applied to larger buildings would essentially not include the bulk of our renters in the city.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
Well, that may be true of licensing, that the licensing is, but the bulk of licensing is with single-family homes and duplexes, but the bulk of the residents are in large multifamily buildings. I'm a owner and operator myself in Minneapolis, and by far the largest buildings contain the largest number of residents, and in fact, our zoning policy, our upzoning policy, which is a great policy to enable the development of new high-density housing, rent control works against that.
Thank you. Any additional comments, Kanani?
Yeah, I would just oppose the fact that rent control, again, there's no data or research to support that a rent control policy has actually had a negative effect in new development in the U.S.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. Now it goes to Kanani first. How will enacting rent control affect property taxes?
That's a great question, and in terms of specifically with Minneapolis, we have seen in the conversations about the specific policy happening in St. Paul, property taxes are a small portion of what is considered the rental price that renters face. And when we're having discussions with small landlords, they're not concerned, and they do not necessarily see a cap at 3%, making it hard for them to pay their property taxes, to have a successful profit margin moving forward. Property taxes in general, there is a way to make sure that we can support the small landlords that are here in Minneapolis, but I just want to highlight that, like Cecil mentioned, most of the rental units are owned by corporate companies, and these costs of passing on property taxes to renters is not going to be the bulk of what's that is what's happened. They are price gouging people regardless.
Thank you. The question goes to Cecil.
Well, this is the challenge of our forum, right? We've got 1 minute to answer a really complex question around property taxes and its interaction with the rent control policy. So, look, the proposals on the table talk about no exemptions, including new construction. Most rent control policies around the country include a 15-year exemption on rent control on new constructed properties, because we don't want to deter new development. The proposals that people are talking about would include that. The growth of the large apartment buildings in the Minneapolis have improved what was formerly parking lots into properties that the city collects a lot more property taxes on. If we don't continue that development and adding the housing, we added 47,000 people since the last census, adding the housing, then we're not adding to our property tax base. If our property tax base freezes, the growth in the city government's budget will fall onto homeowners.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
Yeah, to the new buildings that have happened in the last decade, they're actually, so the average price of a two-bedroom unit that has been built prior to 2000 or after 2010 is over $2,200. So yes, those high prices may be bringing in high property taxes, but the point of rent control is allowing people to stay in their homes. There is a way to do this policy where we can build more and also keep people in their current space. Right now, that's not an option.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
Look, we need housing. The solution that we need is more housing. We need housing at every price point. It's very difficult to build housing at a lower price point without significant subsidy. There's changes that we need to make in the way we produce housing to lower that price point so that we have more affordable housing, we have more housing in general. That's good for the property tax base, that's good for people who want to move to our community, that creates price competition. That's how you get stable rents.
Thank you. The next question goes to Cecil first. Would this amendment help to address racial inequalities in housing?
I don't believe so. And I do think the rent control policy is a race equity issue. When we look at other communities around the country where rent control has been implemented, San Francisco is a great example. San Francisco used to have a much more diverse population. If you visited the Mission District in San Francisco, was a very strong Latinx community that has almost completely evaporated. We think it's really important that people understand that there are unintended consequences of rent control, where people are not able to access housing because there's a reduction of housing opportunity for them, either through the lack of new production or the conversion of existing rental to home ownership, because prices continue to rise. And the motivation of the market is always to get the highest price. So how do we work to use that in our favor in creating a policy with housing solutions?
Thank you. The question now goes to Kanani Omar.
I believe 100% this is a racial equity issue. So over 80% of renters in our city are Black. Over 80% of the renters in our city are Indigenous. If you were a Black resident living in Minneapolis, you saw your rent increase 44% since 2009. Communities of colors have been the most impacted by this housing crisis. During my day, I work as a housing organizer in Harrison Neighborhood Association. Even during this pandemic, we are seeing people come in with rent increases that are between $300 to $500. Putting in a rent control policy that will give people predictable rent increases tied to inflation, CPI, or no more than 3% allows them to plan for the future and allows them to feel comfortable in terms of they're already invested in their communities, but especially with families, it is difficult to pull your children out of school when you're forced out.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
Yeah, well, look, rent control is a price control policy, and economists around the world have said price controls don't work. And when you implement a price control on the income, but not on the expense side, you lead to decision-making that often lowers the quality of the housing because there's not the ability to do the capital reinvestment into the property, into the community, and so you end up with either dereliction or conversion to other uses. And this is the problem with rent control.
Thank you. Any additional comments, Kanani?
Yeah, I would note that in the reality of the housing market right now in Minneapolis, particularly in North Minneapolis, we have corporate landlords in Minneapolis now that have buildings that are in deep need of repair, have mold. Some of them don't have heat in the winter, and this is all under an unregulated market. Having a rent control policy, again, with the study commissioned by the University of Minnesota and CURA, did not provide any evidence that if a policy was implemented, that landlords would stop investing in their properties and maintain improvements.
Thank you. The next question goes to Kanani first. What would the effect of rent stabilization be on the development of affordable housing? And what other alternatives would improve the development of affordable housing?
In terms of creating and building new housing, there is a pathway there that developers take, and they have fixed prices. There is no, in our conversations, and again with the University of Minnesota's CURA study, their conversations with developers, predictable rent increases was not something that they were necessarily scared of. And there has been no data or research to prove that putting in a policy that would cap rents to CPI or 3% would actually have effect in creating affordable housing.
Thank you. The question goes to Cecil Smith.
Well, the policies that are being discussed say no exemptions, so that includes affordable housing. And if we just look at St. Paul as a case study right now, St. Paul is looking at a potential 11% levy increase on their property taxes. That applies to affordable housing. Even though they have a lower tax rate, it's still an 11% increase. But if they're limited to a 3% increase, our analysis shows that that 11% property tax increase consumes almost all of the 3% available increase. Not to mention the fact that we just learned this week, we can all expect 30% increase in our energy costs for heating this winter. Our insurance rates are going up. These are all the price pressures on housing that housing providers have no control over. We don't decide the property taxes. We don't decide our insurance rates. We don't decide the cost of our utilities. Those are determined by others. A rent control on income and expense on income provides no opportunity when we have to absorb those expenses.
Thank you. Any additional comments, Kanani?
Yeah, I'd like again to note the study commissioned by the City Council actually did a model of what would Minneapolis look like if we had instituted rent control back in 2009 after the recession. In that model, capping rents to 3%, they would essentially provide investors the same rate of return. It would not have harmed investors in terms of making a profit. They essentially would have had the same numbers, but it would have stopped the price gouging.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
Well, historical analysis is great because we know all the variables, but predicting and modeling the future, that's a big unknown. We don't know what interest rates are 10 years from now. We don't know what energy costs are 10 years from now. The Cura study just said if you had rent control implemented back in 2000, it would have worked up until 2020. There was no modeling of future projections because how can they model? What are interest rates? What are energy costs? What are insurance rates?
Thank you. We're going to move on to our final question, and it goes to Cecil Smith first. What is your final argument for or against this amendment?
Look, all we're asking Minneapolis voters to do is to take a very close look at rent control and what rent control does in has done in other communities and what it might do in our community. And we think if you think twice about that, you'll vote no on question 3 because it's not the housing solution that we need for our housing challenges that we have in our community. There are other solutions. There's no silver bullet. Rent control doesn't create a single unit of housing, and that's what we need. We need more housing. We need housing for folks who are moving out of homelessness. We need folks that need housing that has supportive services. We need housing for single people. We need housing for large family units. We need just more housing. And rent control, especially the model that's being proposed, does nothing to create more housing. It's the wrong solution for our housing crisis.
Thank you. The question goes to Kanani Omar.
Voting yes on question 3 would allow us to move a step closer to providing housing stability. There is no one who's having the rent control conversation who believes that this is a solve-all problem. We know we need more housing. We know we need more affordability. But what's happening now while we're trying to solve those issues, build more, create more, is that people are being price gouged out of their communities. People are seeing, long-time renters are seeing 20 to 30, sometimes 40% rent increases. We need to stop that. This is an opportunity for us to provide predictability and stability in a time when most don't have that. I encourage everyone who's also interested in this conversation and wants to see a strong policy happen, if we win or if we don't win in November, this conversation of fighting for rent control needs to be about the policy in specifics. We need to get something that reflects the needs of our community. San Francisco is not Minneapolis. New York is not Minneapolis.
Thank you. I thank our 2 speakers for and against the rent control ordinance, and we will now move on to the next ordinance that we are going to discuss. Thank you very much, Cecil. Thank you very much, Kanani. The next amendment we are going to discuss is the Government Structure Executive Mayor Legislative Council Amendment. And this is the language on the ballot. Shall the Minneapolis City Charter be amendment to adopt a change in its form of government to an Executive Mayor Legislative Council structure to shift certain powers to the mayor, consolidating administrative authority over all operating departments under the mayor, and eliminating the executive committee? The speakers are for the amendment, Walter Rockenstein from Charter for Change, and against, David Fay from Faith in Minnesota. We'll go right into questions as we did with the last amendment. And the first question will go to Walter. What would the role of the City Council be if this amendment passes? And how would this change the relationship between the council and the mayor?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for hosting this. And it's great to be back in Mayflower, where both of our children attended preschool. Our granddaughter attended a German immersion preschool, and my son earned in your scout troop his Eagle rank. What would the powers of the City Council be? Well, they're actually strengthened in an important way. They still have the right to pass the budget, the right to pass the city plan, the right to do ordinances, resolutions, and they get a full-time auditor to help them look at the way city programs are operating and see if they are operating properly. What they lose is really the authority to, it's questionable whether they have this authority under the charter, but their ability to interfere with the day-to-day operations of the city, including what they often do, which is to direct city staff to do things that are not part of city policy.
Thank you. The question now goes to David Fay.
So right now, the Minneapolis Police Department reports directly to the mayor. This is the model that is being proposed for all of the city departments. Right now, as I think many of us can observe, this is the most dysfunctional and least accountable department in the city. So the proposal to extend this model to the rest of the city departments is frankly alarming. How it would change the role of the council is equally alarming. Currently, the City Council works very closely with senior staff in the city to develop policy. In the new proposed amendment, the council would not be able to work directly with city staff without the mayor's consent. The word is consent. So basically, this is making the mayor the gatekeeper of access to the city staff with whom the council needs to work in order to fulfill its legislative duties.
Thank you. Any additional comments, Walter?
Well, I simply disagree with the last comment. It does not prohibit the City Council from working with the staff on matters of policy. What it does prohibit is those city council members directing staff what to do, and particularly directing people to do things that are in violation of city policy. And the study by the Charter Commission found that both of those practices were widespread. And the way to deal with that is to make the mayor the chief executive officer.
Thank you. Any additional comments, David?
Yeah, I think it's important to actually read the language. The new proposal is that with the mayor's consent or in a manner that the mayor arranges, the council may seek information or assistance in furtherance of the council's legislative authority. That's pretty clear. The mayor is in control of the council's access to city staff.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. It goes to David first. Will the City Council have sufficient oversight over the executive branch if this amendment passes?
That's a great question, and I would say the answer is clearly no. And in my mind, it's not so much a matter of oversight over the executive branch as over the city operation. I served as deputy mayor with Mayor Ryback and was frankly disturbed to see that because the police chief reported directly to the mayor, many conversations happened in the mayor's office behind closed doors that the council was not even aware of, not to mention the more diverse constituencies that the council represents. This is not transparency. This is not good government.
Thank you. The question goes to Walter Rockenstein.
Well, I think we actually enhance the authority of the council to review what the policies of the city are and whether they're being carried out by adding a full-time auditor, the same way the state has a legislative auditor. And I continue to disagree or I continue to assert that it is not the council's business to tell the city staff what to do, particularly to tell them what to do which is in violation of city policy, which we know is happening, was established by the Charter Commission. The charge that the police department is dysfunctional, my response to that is if you really believe that, The solution is to fire the current mayor. But to say that the mayor is in total charge of that department is wrong. The city council a year ago removed the crime prevention ability and the community policing initiatives from the control of the department. Those are essential to reforming the department, but the mayor no longer has any control over those.
Thank you. Additional comments, David?
There is already an office of auditor in the city. The language about the city clerk and the office and the auditor changes details but doesn't change the function. Those functions already exist.
Thank you. Additional comments, Walter?
The office exists, but it is not under the complete control of the city council, and that is one of the major changes here. That person is appointed and reports directly to the city council.
We'll move on to the next question, and it goes to Walter first. What other cities have this system of government, and how has it worked out, well or poorly, for those cities?
I don't know. Oh, the one that's being proposed in the charter amendment?
Yes.
Well, in the city, in the state of Minnesota, Duluth has it. The city of St. Paul has it, and in both those cities, it seems to have worked out quite well. We do not have similar problems to what we have in Minneapolis with the dysfunction of the government. I mean, I served on the city council for 10 years, and I saw some of my colleagues interfere with the way the city was implementing policy because they didn't want a certain policy applied in their ward that way. That's not fair, that's not open, that's not transparent, and it happened repeatedly. This charter amendment makes the city's system almost the same as the ones in St. Paul and in Duluth.
Thank you. The question now goes to David Frey.
So how effective a mayor and council are really comes down to how effective the mayor and those council members are. There is a wide variety of structures. One of the shocking things to me as deputy mayor at Council of Mayors meetings was to learn how different cities are. I think the really central question here is, why is this coming up now? It's been 40 years since there was a significant attempt at changing the structure of the city. This is coming up now as a direct response to the most diverse and progressive city council that the people of Minneapolis have ever elected, and an unelected body of charter commissioners appointed by a judge who was appointed by Governor Pawlenty has decided that they need to restrict the power of this council. This is not the way to correct disagreements with elected officials. Elections are the way to correct that.
Thank you. Any additional comments, Walter?
Yes, let's first of all note that the Charter Commission is required as a home rule city. It is diverse. There are 3 people of color, 8 women, 6 men on it. It is a diverse body, and it did extensive work on this. Why did it come up now? Well, second point is this is not the last change that was made in 40 years. When I was on the city council, the mayor was significantly strengthened by giving him the authority to propose the city budget and to propose the city plan.
Thank you. Additional comments, David?
It's also important to see who is supporting this proposal. The organizations Charter for Change, all of Minneapolis and Minneapolis Together, are connected with the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce and the Downtown Council. This is the same coalition that has opposed raising the minimum wage, the same coalition that has opposed save and sick leave for workers. If this wasn't a city where all of the leadership is Democratic, we would describe this opposition as Republican.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the next question, even though you've already brought it up somewhat, and that is, why is this amendment being considered now? It goes to David first.
So let's remember the moment we're in. The death of George Floyd, the global reaction to issues of inequity and injustice, and the changing population of our city. This is becoming an amazingly diverse city, but the power structure we have, and in particular citywide offices like the mayor, continue to be elected by the sort of southwest crescent of the most affluent and whitest part of the city. So this proposal is coming up now to intensify the political control of that part of the city by putting more power in the mayor, who's elected by those folks, at the expense of the power of the council and the more diverse people they represent.
Thank you. The question now goes to Walter.
Well, obviously, I disagree with that. If you look at the voting statistics, which I do regularly, the mayor is elected citywide, and you have to get votes from all over the city to do it. And we've had an amazingly diverse number of mayors, including Mayor Sales Belton, who was black, a woman, and who supports this initiative. Secondly, I disagree. I'm not here because the Chamber of Commerce talked to me. I'm here because I believe firmly that the mayor needs to be the chief executive officer of the city. And that puts the responsibility in alignment with the actual authority. At the moment, if you want to figure out what to do with the police department and who to affect there, because the authority is divided, because some portions of the reform are in one area and some portions are in another, you can't figure that out. You can't pin that responsibility down because the authority is not clear.
Thank you. Additional comments, David?
The authority is clear, but it doesn't work, and it doesn't work for political reasons, including the power of the police union. Mayor Fry directed the police department to stop no-knock warrants. There have been over 90 of them since the mayor delivered that directive to the police department. So I think we can see pretty clearly that the system as it is, which this proposal would expand to all city departments, does not work.
Thank you. Additional comments, Walter?
I take just exactly the opposite view of that, which is if you expand that authority, you get both the mayor and the city council in the proper area. And the problem now is with whether police officers follow the mayor's directive is much more with both the union and with the fact that we have at the state level the arbitration requirements which almost make it impossible to actually fire police officers. And that's where that reform has to start.
Thank you. We'll go on to the next question. It goes to Walter first. What other possible solutions would your organization support for addressing the city's government structure?
I think our organization believes this is the most important single change that can be made, because it does align authority with responsibility. It strengthens the mayor, but it also strengthens the city council. I'm trying to think of another reform that would make a difference. And unfortunately, all of them are probably at the state level. They relate to the problem with the police department with the ability to actually discipline officers. That's largely interfered with by state law on arbitration. So I don't see another change, major change, that we would take a position on.
Thank you. Question goes to David Fay.
So representative democracy works best when it is actually representative. And the reason we have a city council is because the wards of our city are very different. The interests of people in the Lakes District are quite different from the interests of people in North Minneapolis on some measures, on some topics. So what would strengthen the city from the way it is now is to actually remove the mayor's exclusive control of the police department and make the police department, like the other departments in the city, reporting to a balance of input from the council members who represent the most diverse constituencies of the city and the mayor who represents a citywide constituency. And as you'll probably hear shortly in the final section, that is part of ballot question number 2. That would accomplish that.
Thank you. Additional comments, Walter?
Well, we're going to continue to disagree on this. I think what that second ballot measure does is it actually increases the 14 boss problem. That there are 14 people giving directions to city staff and to the to the police department, well, not to the police department, although even there, as I pointed out, the city council has removed several of what the police department had authority over that relate directly to reform of the department. But what you have now is 14 bosses and no way to fix responsibility.
Thank you. Additional comments, David?
The 14 bosses claim is wildly overstated. There are individual council members who overstep their authority and meddle in city departments. We could name them. But that is a behavior problem. That is not a charter structure problem. The solution for that problem is for their colleagues to hold them accountable and ask them to stop meddling, or if that doesn't work, to elect new council members.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. It goes to David Fay first. How would the proposed government structure amendment interact with the public safety amendment? Would the passage of the former affect the structural changes in the police oversight proposed in the public safety amendment?
I'm not sure there's a one-minute answer to that question. And I'm not a legal expert on this, but what we've heard is that if both amendment proposals 1 and 2 were to pass, that probably the city attorney's office would need to sort out the inherent conflict between them, which is, as I just mentioned, the public safety amendment removes the mayor's exclusive control of the police department, while the government structure amendment gives the mayor exclusive control of every department. So I'm not the city legal expert, but I believe that will probably take some sorting out.
Thank you. The question goes to Walter.
Clearly, it will have to be sorted out. The work that 2 or 3 attorneys have done on our behalf suggests that in fact, the likely one legal outcome that could be strongly argued is in fact and it's complicated because it relates to what sections of the charter are amended. It appears to these legal experts that you would have a public safety department, but it would be under the control of the mayor.
Thank you.
That's the way they would interact.
Thank you. Additional comments, David?
We'll see.
Yeah, we will.
Okay. Then we'll move on to our final question, and it goes first to Walter. What is your final argument for or against this amendment?
Well, my final argument is the one I've made before. I'm sorry, but we've had now almost, from my service on the council, almost 45 years of the opportunity for citizens to elect council members who follow the rules, or the council members to limit their own colleagues. It's not happened. A structural change is needed, and that change is to make the mayor the chief executive officer of the city, and at the same time enhance the authority of the city council to make sure that their policies are followed by the mayor. It is not the business of the city council members to be interfering in the day-to-day operations of city departments. It's their responsibility to set the basic rules, the policies, the budget, and they can use those effectively to govern the city, and the mayor can do the job of day-to-day operations.
Thank you. Question goes to David Fay.
This is a truly historic election in our city. The candidates on the ballot and all 3 of the proposed amendments to the city charter represent a clear choice between what Minneapolis has been and what it is becoming. Since our founding, Minneapolis has been led by an almost exclusively white political leadership who have built institutions and systems to support their interests, and that's worked well for them. But Minneapolis is changing. It's becoming a wonderfully diverse city, and out of that diversity, we are seeing new systems arise, challenges to those biased systems that create more fairness and social equity for everyone. That's what should be happening. Ballot question number 1 is designed to resist this transformation by further consolidating the power of the traditional white but diminishing part of the city. As Paul Wellstone famously said, we all do better when we all do better. This is why, for the sake of our city, we must vote no on question 1. Thanks.
Thank you. I thank David Fay and Walter Rockenstein for speaking on this amendment. And we'll move on to the last amendment that we're going to discuss. The last amendment we are going to discuss is the Department of Public Safety Amendment. And the language on the ballot reads, shall the Minneapolis City Charter be amendment to remove the police department and replace it with a Department of Public Safety that employs a comprehensive public health approach to the delivery of functions by the Department of Public Safety, with those specific functions to be determined by the mayor and city council by ordinance, which will not be subject to exclusive mayoral power over its establishment, maintenance, and command, and which could include licensed peace officers, which would be police officers, if necessary, to fulfill its responsibilities for public safety, with the general nature of the amendments being briefly indicated in the explanatory note below, which is made part of this ballot. And the explanatory note reads, this amendment would create a Department of Public Safety combining public safety functions through a comprehensive public health approach to be determined by the mayor and council. The department would be led by a commissioner nominated by the mayor and appointed by the council. The police department and its chief would be removed from the city charter. The public safety department could include police officers, but the minimum funding requirement would be eliminated. Our speakers are, for the amendment, Janae Bates from Yes for Minneapolis. Against the amendment, Sonia Samuels from Minneapolis Together. We're going to move right on to questions. And the first question will go to Janae. What would your organization want public safety to look like in Minneapolis in the short term and in the long term?
Thank you for that question. The people, the organizations, the legislators, the Attorney General, and probably everyone in this room wants public safety in the city of Minneapolis to look like one that is responsive and is also proactive. What we have currently in the city of Minneapolis is an armed police response only, one that actually shuts out the people of the city, that doesn't allow real representation, that doesn't give the people of Minneapolis an opportunity to have a say about what keeps them safe. And so in order to fix that, which has been a block in the city charter for the last 60 years, voting yes allows the people to have a right-sized response so that they can be sure that when they pick up the phone, if they have a crisis, that the help that they receive is one that brings actual resolve, that there's de-escalation, that there is a right-sized response, and sometimes there will be a police officer, sometimes it won't, sometimes it'll be a mental health professional, and that's what the city deserves.
Thank you. The question goes to Sandra Samuels.
Yes, thank you very much. And can you tell me the question again? I'm sorry.
What would your organization want public safety to look like in Minneapolis in the short term and in the long term?
In the short term and in the long term, what we would like public safety to look like is a system, a new system of public safety, which would ensure that the George Floyds of the world are not murdered under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer. And that Anaya Allen, the 6-year-old killed in my neighborhood, that she gets to live. That LaDavion Garrett Jr., who is struggling for his life, that he would not be shot in the head at 10. Trinity Addison Smith, that she would not be killed. It would be a both and. We would reform policing because we need police, but we'd also have enough police to keep our children and our elderly folks safe.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
I absolutely agree that we need a system that does that, which is why we're advocating to vote yes on ballot measure 2. What that actually does is it makes it possible for
the folks like George Floyd to not have to be worried about being harmed over $20, but it also makes it possible for those children, for those who have been the victim of gun violence in the city, to also have intervention and prevention, which police officers currently do not do.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Yeah, that's simply not true. What this amendment would do is it wants to eliminate the police department. 75% of black people have said that we do not want less police. It eliminates the department, it eliminates the chief, it eliminates funding. That goes in the opposite direction of what we are saying that we need. And so it does not keep this thing that more police don't keep neighborhoods safe. Come move to my neighborhood in North Minneapolis and tell me if you think that's true.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae? Oh, we already did that. We'll move on to the next question. And it goes first to Sandra. I should watch my check marks here. Sandra, this is the next question. Is this charter amendment necessary to provide the changes needed for public safety?
It is wholly unnecessary. There is nothing in this charter amendment that hasn't been done and that can't be done. We're talking about more mental health professionals. The city currently has a $6 million contract right now without the amendment to have a new mental health response. The city was already doing co-responder with Hennepin County, who actually knows how to do co-response with the police. We were already doing that. That got cut. The city we already have violence prevention specialists. That's already happening. This amendment is a Trojan horse. It is asking us to do a bunch of things that we're already doing, and the guise is really to defund and eliminate the police department in Minneapolis.
Thank you. The question goes to Janae Bates.
Yes, it is absolutely necessary to do that. Sandra is correct that the city has attempted to have a co-response, has attempted to have things like COPE with the Hennepin County professionals, and it's been very much drastically underfunded and not able to get to scale. A huge reason is because of this block in the city charter. Another thing that I want to add is that the contract that Sandra mentioned, it was most certainly fully funded by the city council members, and Minneapolis Police Department has failed to execute the contract. When they were asked why, there were crickets. And that is what we continue to get from Minneapolis Police Department, is crickets. They do not have to tell city council members or the mayor anything, which means that you, as people who live within the city, don't get to know what they're doing, how they're doing it. That can be changed by voting yes on 2.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Yes, the big thing is that it's not just that it hasn't been funded in all of this things that Janae is talking about. What this amendment doesn't do, and I think we all wanted it to happen, is we wanted to be able to fix the police contract. This amendment is silent on that. We wanted to be able to fix rogue cops so that when the chief wants to discipline them and fire them, that he or she can. That's arbitration rules. This is silent on that. It doesn't get to any structural difference. It is just intended to eliminate the police from the city of Minneapolis.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
It's just false that this would be about eliminating police officers. The reality is that in the state of Minnesota, police are required by statute to respond to a whole series of situations and events. So it is not in the realm of reality that we would not have police. Also, this doesn't even get rid or eliminate the police department. The department would still continue to exist, but that it will now be expanded. It's expanded in a way that you can also add mental health professionals, homeless outreach, crisis interventions. That's what it does.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. It goes to Janae first. Are there other cities that have created a Department of Public Safety? And how has that worked out for them, well or poorly?
Yes, in fact, there are many, many cities across the country and right here in the state of Minnesota who have a Department of Public Safety. One of those is Richland, for example. The reality is that Minneapolis happens to be an anomaly. It is the only city in the entire state that has this very rigid rule about the number of officers in their city charter. So that is right. In the city constitution, the Minneapolis Police Federation put in their own contract, which has made it why it's been so hard to negotiate with them about anything from trainings to discipline. And so this does actually speak to the issue of arbitration, because arbitration happens after discipline takes place. And so this gives the opportunity for the people of Minneapolis to finally have a say, to finally get to have some involvement in transparency and accountability with a police department that has been able to avoid that for the last 60 years.
Thank you. The question goes to Sandra.
So Janae is from St. Paul, and I know why she's here debating this is because St. Paul is doing really well with their police reforms. St. Paul, if we had the same amount of police officers as St. Paul, we would have, St. Paul currently has, if we had the same officers as St. Paul has 615 officers right now, only 300,000 residents. We have 578 police officers and 430 residents. We would have 870 cops per person. People per cop. I think I got that right. It would be incredible, and they are doing an amazing job with reform. That's why Janae is here, because she doesn't need to be there. But those of us who live here, we know that we have not had 4 black police chiefs like St. Paul has. And the things that they have instituted, our only black chief is trying to do, and we need to stand with him and give him time.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
You're right. St. Paul does have a police department, but that department does not exist in their city charter. As a matter of fact, if you go through the city charter of St. Paul, no reference to police at all. The other thing that is important to note is that another person lives in St. Paul, Jaleel Stallings. He's the man who was beaten by the police department, by Minneapolis Police Department, to the point to where his eye socket was broken. He was hit with 40-millimeter bullets that were less lethal. The police also lied about the entire incident, willing to send him to prison for over a decade. That was a St. Paul man. Minneapolis Police Department doesn't care where I live. The reality is that this department is in desperate need of real reform with teeth, not the rehashing of the same reforms that have been done over and over and over again. And a step towards that is by saying yes on question 2.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Yes, is that what happened to Jaleel Stalling is egregious. We all agree that what happened to George Floyd was egregious. It is not a reason to throw away our police and our department. And Janae said earlier that we're not getting rid of the police department. It says it in the amendment that we will be eliminating the police department. And by the way, the other cities that have a public safety department, like Richfield, I believe, they also have a police department embedded. We are eliminating that because this is about having as few police as we can possibly have in the city. And when you're at the height of crime and violence, now is not the time to experiment on black and brown bodies.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question, and it goes to Sandra first. This amendment changes the balance of power over public safety between the City Council and the mayor. How will that change affect public safety?
Oh, gosh. For any of you who work at any place, anybody who's ever had a job, you had a CEO. You had an executive. And to talk about policing and to have not one commander, but 15, because it would be the mayor, the 13 council members, and a commissioner who is a civilian. Our African-American chief said that this would be wholly unbearable. Let me translate that for you. He would be gone November 3rd.
Thank you. The question goes to Janae Bates.
This is about having citywide representation. We know that currently the Minneapolis Police Department is an anomaly from the rest of the charters of the city departments, which we just saw in the last debate. The reality is that the most well-functioning corporations actually also have board members. In the state of Minnesota, when we're talking about Target, they have 13 board members. They have a CEO, but they also have a group of people that makes sure that there are checks and balances. That is what we're asking for the police department. That is what we're asking for the Department of Public Safety, that we have true checks and balances, that these actually function in a way where people get to have a say. That is not something that should be talked about as bureaucracy or chaos, but actually direct representation, an ability to have transparency and accountability. That should be something that the city of Minneapolis should be really, really welcoming and open to welcome with open arms at this point.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Yes, absolutely. You know, in St. Paul, they have a mayor system where the mayor is the CEO of the police department, right? And they have some results that I admire. 32 homicides, only 32 homicides. We've had 76 here in the city. It is completely different. There are checks and balances. The St. Paul Police Department is being held up as a paragon of reform. We can do that here too. All we have to do is to believe, and we are not going back to where we were. You know why? Because George Floyd changed it for all of us.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
We have seen violent crime rise across the country, and every single one of those deaths is something to grieve and to mourn. And it is also important to recognize that police did not prevent those deaths. Even in the city of Minneapolis, where the police are currently fully funded, even though they have admitted that they've had a very hard time filling those positions, and they're actually losing officers because they have named that they have felt far too stretched. This is an opportunity to give them the right resources that they need so that they aren't continually called into positions and situations that they're not prepared for.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question, and it goes to Janae Bates first. How many police officers should the city have, and why?
That's a really great question, and it is one that the city should be able to take a real and contemplated and thoughtful data-driven process to figure out. The reality is because of the city charter, you don't get the opportunity to do that. Instead, you have to stick to a rule that was put in place by the Minneapolis Police Federation 60 years ago. In 1961, they determined for you, this is how many armed officers you should have, and that's all you should have. This charter change makes it possible for you to have an actual process that is data-driven, that actually looks at neighborhoods, looks at the 911 calls that are taking place, determines, okay, they're getting calls about this, this, and this. How do we actually staff this to meet the needs of the people, to keep every single person safe, no matter what they look like or how much money they have in their pocket or the language they speak?
Thank you. Question goes to Sandra.
We have 578 police officers in the city of Minneapolis for 430,000 people. We have the least number of police officers per citizen than any other large city in the country. I don't have to be hyperbolic around this. If you live in neighborhoods that are being disproportionately impacted, you know you ain't got enough police. We didn't have enough police when we had the height of police, and the chief, when we had 888 officers at the beginning of 2019, the chief was asking for 400 more. Guess what? In St. Paul recently, and again, they already have more officers than we and less citizens, their chief is saying we don't have enough. We need to let law enforcement, along with elected officials, make the decision and not kind of the imaginary kind of wonderings of a political action committee.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
It is incredibly important for the people of Minneapolis, for the actual experience of the people of Minneapolis to have a say about what keeps them safe. And again, we know that the current armed police only response has not done that. I don't think anyone in this room or anyone in the city would say, yes, having police only respond and the current model that we have in the city of Minneapolis is working. We all know it's failing. That has been the failed experiment, and it has definitely been the failed experiment on Black folks for the last 60 years. That is something that can be changed by voting yes.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Yeah, so it is, Okay, so Janae's in St. Paul, so she might not know, but let me give the reality. I live in North Minneapolis. I've lived there for 24 years, raised 3 girls, and we've never had an only police response. I've had police athletic league folks out, bike cops out, crime prevention specialists, social workers, along with police, mental health. Everything this amendment is asking for, y'all, we've already been doing. We just need to do it better. We don't need to change the charter.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. It goes to Sandra first. Many people have low trust in the Minneapolis Police Department, especially in communities of color. What would your organization propose to improve that trust?
Absolutely. We're doing it right now, by the way, because it is so true. It is the groups that benefit most from more police are Black and brown, and the ones who are harmed from more police are also Black and brown. We've known we have a problem. And this, I tell you, this George Floyd moment is actually really changing things for us. We have a Black police chief. In our area, we have a Black inspector, and we have white cops, Black cops, and we are meeting together. The cops are so few right now that we are walking lockstep. Even people who have been involved in gangs are crying out for police partners. I promise you, I'm telling you the truth. And so we want to continue to build, continue to have the meetings that we've been having together, continue to change the training that's happening. The chief is working on doing that, getting rid of warrior training, getting rid of chokeholds and stopping people unnecessarily. We're doing more of that, and we're in relationship. We want better cops, not less cops.
Thank you. The question goes to Janae.
Voting yes on question 2 makes it possible for police officers to be called into situations that they're trained for, well-disciplined for, and that they can finally start to have that right relationship with community, to build the relationship with community in a way that we can trust them again. We've known, and especially in the recent body camera footage has been released, where they have named that they're out hunting people, have said race-based comments that are most certainly directed against Black people, that this is not something that we can just say, oh, put them through another training and that will fix it. Folks know what keeps them safe. It's having the right resources, the things that they actually need, and investing in that. This is an opportunity for the communities across the city of Minneapolis to finally start to have exactly what they need and trust that when they pick up the phone, the right size response shows up. And again, sometimes that will be an armed police officer. No one is saying that we should get rid of them. We actually know that we do need them in certain situations. And so this is an ability for us to actually make that right stewardship of resources in a smart way.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Right now, you have 76 people murdered in the city of Minneapolis, 530 people shot, 84% of them are Black, 83% of them are male, 50% of them are children 0 to 26, 51% of them are in my neighborhood. Right now, what we are asking for is we are asking for enough police officers. Not maybe we could have some if necessary. Where I live, that's not a question I want in my charter. It is necessary. We just have to, and we can, transform our relationship, and I promise you we're doing that.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
Minneapolis Police Department, as it exists now, is failing at the one job that they were hired for, which is exactly what Sandra Samuels is saying, that violence is rising, even though they are fully funded. That homicide cases are going unsolved, rape kits are going untested. We haven't gotten to the actual root cause of crime, like poverty, like unstable housing. This is an opportunity to start to really deal with both, again, intervention and prevention, that we can lower the issues of violence over time, but that we can also have the right size response today.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. It goes to Janae first. Many people are concerned about crime in Minneapolis. What would your organization propose to reduce crime?
So there has been quite a bit of evidence that there are a series of things that do work about reducing gun violence. And it actually has not been about pouring more money into an armed police response only. It is about community engagement and involvement. It's about something called hotspotting. And quite frankly, the Office of Violence Prevention, which is currently in the Health Department in Minneapolis, has been doing quite a bit of that work. Again, on a small scale, with a small budget and very little power, but actually integrating that and making it fully comprehensive with the Department of Public Safety. They can also work alongside police officers to get that to scale. The city of Boston was able to decrease their youth gun violence by 79% by doing kinds of work like that. That is something that the city of Minneapolis can implement right away, and they'll already have built the infrastructure to make it happen.
Thank you. The question goes to Sandra.
Could you repeat the question?
Many people are concerned about crime in Minneapolis. What would your organization propose to reduce crime?
So we're proposing both, Ann, that we both have police reform. If you want police reform, so Janae keeps saying they're going to have armed police. By the way, my community doesn't want just armed police. We want police armed with a ball, with a basketball, and a bike as well. But anyway, what we're seeing with the rising crime is we want both, Ann. We want both reform. This amendment is agnostic on reform, nothing about reform in it. And we want increased public health supports, mental health, social workers, addiction. By the way, we have an encampment in North Minneapolis now on Penn Avenue. The addiction workers will not go in because there aren't enough cops to go in with them, y'all, okay? And we want a sufficient number of police to do both and to keep us safe. And Janae saying the police have been fully funded, that is untrue. We have 578 police officers. That doesn't sound like fully funded to me.
Thank you. Additional comments, Janae?
They are fully funded. Again, the reality is that it's $187 million a year for the police department that they are funded to have. They have not been able to get the number of cops into the position because they have named that they've been stretched to capacity. We know that in addition to the $60 million in funding that had to go into police brutality and lawsuit settlements, there's also the $30 million plus right now that is going into issues of PTSD. These are solvable problems that the city can actually do by voting yes.
Thank you. Additional comments, Sandra?
Yeah, so Janae said that the cops are stretched thin. You know why they're stretched thin? I don't know if any of you have any police officers in your family. They are human beings. Their bosses stood up on a stage a year and a half ago with a big behind sign that said defund police. If you've ever had employees, if I go to my employees and say, by the way, I'm working on defunding you, I don't know how you think morale would be. They're being spat upon, they are being cursed at. Of course, I don't know who would be a police officer at this time in this city. Now, is some of it justified because of our emotions around the rogueness of police? Absolutely. But they are under capacity because of initiatives like Yes 4 that want to change the amendment to say we are eliminating you and we're eliminating your chief.
Thank you. We'll now move on to our final question. It goes to Sandra first. What is your final argument for why voters should vote for or against this amendment?
My final argument is this. I live in one of the roughest places in this city. Even North Minneapolitans will tell you they wouldn't live, black ones, they wouldn't live where my husband and I live. People, we have neighbors who are leaving. They can't stay because their children are being traumatized. We have school children who are being shot at and shot in the head. Maybe if a smartphone caught Trinity jumping up and down on her trampoline when that bullet went in her head, then we would be saying both and. What I know is that people who support this amendment are committed to racial justice. Amen and hallelujah. But the issues in Minneapolis are not just about police. We need racial justice in education and housing and health and income and wealth and incarceration. That's the hard work. Just saying, let's eliminate the police, that's the easy part. But if you're really about racial justice, you'll do what this state and this city fails to do repeatedly, and that's listen to brown and black folks. 75% have said they do not want less police. Only 42% have said they want a Department of Public Safety. I beg you to listen to us for a change.
Thank you. Now, question. Thank you. Now, we need to hear from Janae. Janae, would you like to answer that question? Why voters should vote for or against this amendment?
People across Minneapolis, black folks, white folks, indigenous folks, people with very little money or a lot of money, they all want similar things. They all want to be safe in community, and that means they want to be safe from both violence from police officers and violence in community. And that is something that is possible. Unfortunately, the current city charter blocks any real attempts at real reforms to make that happen. And so this amendment was brought forward by people across race, including a bunch of black people who live over north who are currently knocking doors, talking to their neighbors right now about how they believe that they can be safe and how they want to have a say about that. And so voting yes just means that you're ready to do that today, not to discuss it for another few years, not to continue to show up to more and more council meetings and hope that your mayor makes a good choice about protecting the people of Minneapolis. That you actually say today, we collectively across the city are going to take a step forward by voting yes on question 2.
Thank you. I thank Janae Bates and Sandra Samuels for speaking on this amendment. In-person attendees are invited to head outdoors to the courtyard for a chance to continue the conversation with our presenting organizations. There will also be a table with volunteers to answer questions about topics such as early voting and same-day registration. We thank the speakers for their participation, Mayflower Church for taping this event and for the use of their facilities, and you, the audience, for your attendance and interest. Let your voice be heard. Vote by November 2nd. Thank you.